I froze. It was Alistair. A voice came from the dark. "What are you holding there, boy?" The barrel of the rifle was already pointed at me.
I grew up in a small, gloomy mountain town called Brackenberg, high up in Austria. For outsiders, the only thing they might know about us is the story of the old Gothic church that was destroyed in the last century. Its remains now sitting in the Museum of Religious History in Zurich, Switzerland. Beyond the town's borders, there are only misty, rugged trails and abandoned silver mines a few miles away. But apart from that, there is nothing here but dust, gravel, black pine trees, and scattered wooden cabins. I was raised by my mother alone after my father disappeared. And while words like discipline or rules didn't seem to exist in her daily vocabulary, there was one strict warning she repeated like a death sentence. Never go near the cabin of old Alistair Vance. Alistair lived in a secluded wooden shack on the northern edge of town, earning his living by collecting rare wild herbs, drying them, and selling them to pharmacists or turning them into medicinal extracts. He spent most of his time in the forest at night, but even when villagers spotted him, fear would silence them completely, knowing he was rumored to have made a man disappear once, and the authorities never dared to charge him. My mother told me he was an evil charlatan, and that the man he supposedly killed had been her older brother and her closest support in life. That was all she ever said, as if the memory was too painful to reopen. Over the years, I picked up fragments of rumors about Alistair's life and the strange rituals he was said to perform without consequence. I learned he had spent his youth on colonial expeditions into the jungles of Africa, volunteering for those dangerous journeys himself. But after returning, he was never the same again. He moved his cabin near the foggy Blind Lake, and elders warned young people not to go near the northern shore after sunset, because old Alistair would be there hunting foxes for his meals. "None of us want him mistaking you for a fox in the dark, do we?" the old man Hines would say with a sharp, serious look that left no room for doubt. But not everyone feared him. Some people almost pitied him. I remember when I was 14, I was walking with a friend when his mother was driving us somewhere in a wooden cart. The conversation turned to Alistair, and my friend spoke about him like he was a monster from stories. But his mother simply said sadly, "That poor man, all he wants is to be left alone." My friend protested, saying he had killed someone, but her expression suddenly changed, like a mask slipping into place, and she sharply warned him to stay away from the cabin. It felt like we had accidentally uncovered something hidden. I didn't understand what at the time. By the age of 17, Alistair had become, in my mind, the embodiment of evil itself. One night, my mother drank too much and finally told me the dark story of how her brother disappeared. She wasn't an alcoholic. She just had a few warm drinks on cold Friday nights while watching old shows. But that night, I came home to find her crying over old black and white photos of her youth, including her late brother. She said he had been out by the lake with friends when he stepped into the bushes and saw someone carrying a metal box with strange markings, with the faint sound of a child crying from inside it. He shouted at the man, who ran immediately. Her brother and his friends chased him through rough terrain until they cornered him at the rocks. The man dropped the box, turned, and fired a strange weapon. Bang, 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 killing her brother instantly. The child inside was later taken to the hospital, but died from a massive overdose of sedatives that destroyed her organs. Everyone who was there claimed Alistair was the shooter, yet he was never arrested or convicted. That was the moment everything clicked in my mind. I finally understood why everyone feared or hated him. As months passed, that hatred grew until I decided I had to act. I told my friends everything, and they knew how deeply I despised Alistair for what he had done to my mother's life. One night around a campfire, I suggested taking action. One of my friends had asked his father about the child who died from an overdose, and he confirmed the story, though with one difference. The child was found in town, not near the lake. That detail didn't matter to me. The story remained the same in my mind, and Alistair had to pay for what he had done. That night, I made my plan. I would go to his cabin after midnight, make sure he was asleep, and then burn it down. I now realize how foolish that was. I might have killed him, but at that age, I only imagined him running out in panic while his cabin burned, forced to leave and disappear. I stole a can of chemical solvent from school because I had no money. On a dark Friday night, after sitting by the campfire with my friends, I lied and said I was going home, but instead I headed toward Alistair's cabin. It took me an hour walking along the foggy lakeshore. When I got close, I turned off my flashlight and followed the water's edge until I saw a faint light from his cabin. I watched for nearly 40 minutes until the radio inside stopped and the light went out. After another minute of silence, I moved in. My heart was pounding as I approached the wooden walls. I thought I had gotten away unseen, but just as I was about to open the container of flammable liquid, I heard a sharp mechanical click to my right, the unmistakable sound of a hunting rifle. A voice came from the dark. "What are you holding there, boy?" I froze. It was Alistair. He told me to drop it. A beam of light landed on the can. Then he ordered me to turn around so he could see my face before killing me. But I couldn't move. I was shaking uncontrollably. He grabbed me, turned me around, and when he saw my face, he stepped back and lowered his gun. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he suddenly said my name. I went from terrified to completely confused. He knew me. He even knew my mother. He said, "I wondered how long it would take you to come here." The first words I managed were, "How do you know me?" Instead of shooting me, he brought me inside his cabin and promised to tell me everything. Inside, surrounded by dried herbs and old books, he asked what my mother had told me about him. I told him everything, how I believed he had murdered my uncle and destroyed our family. He listened quietly, then said, "All right, kid, here is what really happened." He claimed my uncle had been deeply troubled since childhood and became increasingly unstable as he grew older. He was expelled for stealing from girls' changing rooms. He was later accused of inappropriate behavior toward younger students, though charges were reduced. And in the months before his death, he was seen behaving suspiciously around children. That night by the lake, Alistair said he was out hunting when he saw drunk teenagers moving through the bushes under the full moon. One of them was carrying an unconscious child. He followed them and realized they intended to harm her. When he confronted them, one of them tried to attack the child, so he shot him dead. He then rescued the girl, carried her to town, and left her at a gas station before reporting the incident himself. The police confirmed his account, and he was released. But he never forgave himself. After returning from Africa, he vowed never to harm a human being again. He lived in isolation because he couldn't bear the thought that the real criminals had escaped justice. He told me he didn't expect me to believe him, but asked me to return home and confront my mother with the truth. I did exactly that, and whatever happened in that final confrontation destroyed my relationship with her forever. I haven't returned to Austria in almost 20 years since that night. In the winter of 1993, my fiancée and I were driving through the foggy, winding bends stretching from the city of Portland to a small coastal town in Upper Maine called Whispering Pines, where his retired parents lived. Around noon, we had been cruising through dense, dark pine forests that hugged the highway for hours on end when, suddenly, the trees vanished in an abrupt blur. It was like emerging from a dark tunnel into a vast, naked expanse. But instead of seeing rocky shores or natural cliffs, all that stretched before our eyes was land entirely blanketed in black ash and the charred remains of timber. There had obviously been a massive fire that completely devoured the vegetation a short while ago. Although my fiancé tried to reassure me, explaining that local authorities sometimes resort to controlled burns to clear forests and protect them from pests, the scenery still sent a cold shiver down my spine. We were suddenly freed from the cage of trees that had blocked our view on either side of the road, and we could see the horizon extending for miles and miles around us. Thanks to this sudden clearing, it was incredibly easy for me to spot the silhouette of a large man holding the hand of a petite woman, walking at a slow pace amidst that scorched earth. I only caught sight of them from a distance at first, but the way they walked radiated a deceptive sense of tranquility and peace. At first glance, the scene looked like an old man taking his ailing wife out for a gentle stroll to breathe in the sea air across the open space. However, As I watched them with curiosity from the car window, I noticed that they were heading toward an old stone structure that resembled an abandoned family crypt in the middle of the town's ancient cemetery. I didn't say a single word to my fiancée. We were enjoying a comfortable, precious hiatus of silence while soft music drifted from the car's cassette player. So I simply kept watching the scene zoom in, becoming clearer as our speed carried us through an almost dead silence. By the time the duo reached the threshold of the stone crypt, I could see them in almost perfect detail. The old man wore a long, threadbare wool coat, and bald spots were visible on the crown of his head, which was covered in thinning gray hair. The woman wore a blue cotton dress and white canvas shoes, and the thick, undulating waves of her silver hair draped clearly over her shoulders. In the brief seconds we drove right past them, I saw it with an absolute clarity that left no room for doubt. The old man suddenly hoisted the petite woman into his arms, and with a violent heave, tossed her straight down into the dark, yawning opening of the unsealed stone crypt. I remember screaming, "Oh my God," at the top of my lungs the exact second after she fell. As my fiancée panicked, gripping the wheel tightly and frantically asking what the hell was going on, I was hysterically tearing through my handbag looking for my mobile phone. I briefly thought about telling him to stop the car and get out, but a horrific, sudden image flashed through my mind. I envisioned our dead bodies lying in that black ash, riddled with gunshot wounds. So I just screamed at him to step on the gas and keep driving, blurted out that a man had just thrown a woman inside an abandoned crypt. He replied in sheer, utter bewilderment. What? What on earth are you talking about? He had been entirely focused on navigating the rugged road and hadn't glinted a thing. But once I explained the details with more crucial gravity and precision, he asked if I was 100% sure I wasn't mistaken, finally starting to grasp the source of the terror that had seized me. I eventually managed to find my phone, but when I unlocked the screen, I saw that the signal was completely dead. 0 bars. I instantly resorted to the alternative and pulled the paper map from the glove compartment to locate the nearest town. I felt a wave of relief when I found a small coastal settlement called Silver Haven just a few miles down the highway. I told my fiancé to put his foot down so we could reach it and dial emergency services. When we rolled into the town limits, the first place we hit along the roadside was a tiny diner and tavern called Julian's Kitchen. We veered sharply into the parking lot, and I nearly tripped and fell as I ran like a maniac from the car to the front doors. The moment I burst inside, the heads of every single patron spun toward me in shock as I rushed up to the wooden counter, begging the waitress to use their landline phone. The lady behind the counter calmly said, "Sure," and pushed the handset toward me. I immediately dialed 911 and asked to speak to the police. As I described what I had witnessed to the dispatcher, a heavy silence fell over the tavern. Everyone was eavesdropping, and I heard audible gasps of horror ripple through the room when I stated that I had seen a woman get thrown into an abandoned crypt in the middle of the burned site. The dispatcher told me to wait right where I was so the sheriff could send a deputy over. I thanked her and hung up the cradle. The adrenaline was still coursing violently through my veins, controlling my body as I set the receiver down. When I turned around, every single person in that establishment was staring at me with frozen, stone-cold expressions. The lady behind the counter stepped forward and brought me a glass of ice water to help calm my nerves. While my fiancée and I waited for the police to show up, a man got up from his table in the corner and slowly approached us. He introduced himself, then began questioning us in a suspicious tone about the specific characteristics of the burned fields we had passed. When I recounted what I had seen, emphasizing how the blackened terrain stretched for miles, the man turned to one of the other diners and asked aloud if that land belonged to a man named Thomas Calder. That name seared itself into my memory with absolute precision. He then asked me to describe the old man I had spotted. Soon enough, everyone in the diner seemed to agree that the man was indeed Thomas Calder, and that his sick wife had been staying with him at his country estate that week because her doctor was out of state. A look of bewilderment washed over their faces, but it was laced with a strange wariness and a distinct, underlying suspicion. It was glaringly obvious that they knew this man very well. So hearing that he had committed something so monstrous seemed entirely beyond belief to them. They asked me several times if I was absolutely certain of what I saw. When I assured them that I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life, eerie whispers and low murmurs of unease began to echo through the room. I have no idea exactly how much time crawled by before a deputy actually showed up to speak with us. When he arrived, he requested that we step outside to our car so we could talk in detail away from the prying ears inside the diner. I repeated the whole sequence of events again, only to face the exact same skeptical reaction from the deputy, as if what I was reporting bordered on the impossible or a ridiculous piece of fiction. Right as he was grilling me with these interrogation-like questions, a second cruiser rolled into the lot. The county sheriff himself stepped out, having driven all the way from headquarters to talk to us. The deputies spared me from spinning my yarn for a fourth time by explaining precisely what I had reported seeing. The sheriff displayed the same cold, detached amusement, then walked a few paces away to murmur into his radio for a couple of minutes before returning to where we stood. The sheriff informed us that an officer at headquarters had called the Calder residence to ask him about my report. He stated that Thomas completely denied the allegation, claiming that although his wife was indeed home with him, neither of them had gone anywhere near that old cemetery or the burned grounds all day. At that point, I was practically begging the sheriff to get into his car and follow us down the highway so I could point out the exact location of the stone crypt. He replied with chilling indifference that he lacked the authority to trespass on private property and search a family crypt without an official warrant, and that he would have to interview Mr. Calder face-to-face before any such action could be taken. I tried to maintain my composure. I knew that the longer we wasted on this futile debate, the slimmer that woman's chances of survival became inside that pitch-black tomb, regardless of what lay at the bottom. If the crypt had deep underground vaults, she could suffocate or succumb to fractures. She needed to be pulled out immediately. I tried to convey all of these frantic fears with every ounce of energy I had left, but the more animated and insistent I became, the more the sheriff and his deputies stared at me as if I were suffering from a sudden psychotic episode of delusion and hysteria. I literally had to beg the sheriff until he finally, reluctantly ordered his deputy to drive out to the old crypt on that property to check things out. When the deputy finally drove off, a surge of genuine relief washed over me, nearly bringing me to tears. The entire time we waited, my fiancée kept patting my shoulder, soothingly saying, "It's going to be okay. You'll see. This crisis will end fine." The sheriff sat half-slouched in his car, muttering in a low tone over his radio. Suddenly, he bolted upright, walked over to us, and announced in a dry, clipped voice that he had good news. Firstly, the deputy reported that he found the crypt completely sealed and locked tight with its ancient padlocks, with absolutely no signs of forced entry. Secondly, Mr. Calder was currently on his way down to the diner with his wife, so I could see for myself that everything was fine and that the woman was alive and well. The shock knocked the wind out of me for a second, leaving me speechless because I was, and still am, absolutely certain of what my eyes witnessed out there amidst the ash. The sheriff took that window to explain, in a patronizing tone, how I had undoubtedly fallen victim to a visual misunderstanding. The two individuals I saw were probably just collecting artifacts or inspecting the building's foundations, and whatever scene of throwing or dropping I thought I saw was merely an optical illusion caused by the speed of our car and the smoke that was still thick in the air. The only question I managed to muster when words finally found their way back to me was, how can the deputy be so sure the crypt is empty? Did he actually unlock the doors and go inside to check? Did he inspect the dark catacombs beneath the floor with his flashlight? I knew what I saw. A human life was hanging in the balance, and I wasn't about to buy hollow reassurances, especially when they started tossing around phrases like optical illusion or trick of the light. The more they insisted on repeating those words, the more sinister and suspicious it sounded to my ears. I understood the small-town mentality of wanting to protect one of their own, but the cold, dismissive way they brushed off a potential murder began to cross the line from alarming to deeply disturbing. Just as I was trying to suppress my rage, fighting to keep my tone polite while explaining to the sheriff that I knew what I saw, the deputy's cruiser pulled back into the lot. But trailing right behind the deputy was a battered, ancient pickup truck. The moment it ground to a halt, a massive man stepped out, wearing a heavy wool coat, the bald patches on his head framed by thin gray hair. His very first words, delivered in a hostile, booming tone, were, "Now who's this saying I threw my damn wife inside a tomb of the dead?" The sheriff stepped toward him, trying to pacify him. "Easy now, Thomas, calm down. She's just a passerby trying to help." This man, named Thomas, marched around to the passenger side of his truck, yanked the door open, and roughly helped a woman step down from the seat. He then led her toward us with an aggressive, accusatory grip, barking that this was the wife I had allegedly thrown into a grave. My fiancée whispered in a low, placating murmur, "See? I told you everything would be fine." He sounded desperate to dissolve the volatile confrontation. But things were not fine at all. The woman I had watched through the car window, amidst the ash, possessed thick, undulating silver hair that cascaded clearly over her shoulders. The woman standing before us now had dark, extremely short, cropped curly hair. The panic seized my chest all over again, and I cried out in a hysterical tone, insisting to them that this was not the same woman I'd seen out there. The deputy tried to cut me off, claiming that the harsh sunlight reflecting off the smoke and ash must have made her dark hair look like a gleaming silver from a distance. Their systematic, relentless attempt to make me feel like I was insane or losing my mind made me want to scream at the top of my lungs. But I knew that breaking down would be the final nail in the coffin of my credibility. Instead, I forced myself to hold it together and asked if there were state investigators from outside the town I could speak to, as I felt zero confidence in their local procedures. While I was talking to the deputy, the sheriff signaled for my fiancé to step away for a private word. A few minutes later, my fiancé walked back, a bizarre paleness covering his face. He grabbed my arm with a firm grip and told me, in a tone that brooked no argument, that we needed to leave immediately. The sheriff had point-blank asked my fiancé if I suffered from mental illness or took heavy sedatives. When my fiancé nodded, just to protect me, the sheriff issued a stern, threatening warning to get me out of town right that second before I was arrested on charges of inciting a public disturbance and disrupting the peace. He made it clear that they would not tolerate outsiders rolling into their town, throwing around random accusations, and dragging the name of a prominent local citizen through the dirt. Therefore, unless we had official business to attend to, we were to leave immediately or face jail time. By that point, I was the one who desperately wanted to flee. A creeping, sickening dread slithered through my entire body. I could feel the suffocating weight of a dark network of evil ruling this small town, and I knew we would never unearth the bottom of this conspiracy while standing in the parking lot of that damn tavern. I offered a hollow, generic apology to that farmer and his alleged wife, whoever that poor, silent woman standing there actually was. The moment we crossed back onto the highway and my phone regained reception, I called the main state trooper barracks to report the entire incident. I told them that something deeply twisted and corrupt was happening inside that town, specifically on the property of a man named Thomas Calder. However, they got back to me days later with a dry, standardized report stating that they had dispatched an independent investigator and found absolutely no evidence of a crime or falsified identities. I tried to pursue the official complaints channel, asserting that my report was being handled with blatant negligence and that there was foul play involved, but the response came back unchanged. They had exhausted all legal avenues of inspection, and there was nothing further to investigate. But I know what my eyes saw. I have never suffered from any form of visual hallucination in my entire life. Not before that day, and never since. My vision is perfectly sharp, I do not require corrective lenses, and no, I'm not crazy. But I remain absolutely certain that the silver-haired woman is still resting somewhere beneath the black ash of that stone crypt. My father was a geological engineer who spent his youth exploring polar mines for international entities, and that was where he met my mother while working in the far reaches of the frozen Novaya Zemlya Islands in northern Russia. My mother's heritage and her polar culture were fundamental pillars of her life, so details like traditional northern dishes and the folklore music of the Sami culture were an integral part of my childhood and upbringing. We only visited those desolate parts once when I was a little kid. So, in my late 20s, I made the decision to pack my bags and fly over there to visit my remaining relatives and explore the land of my ancestors a wee bit. I was driving a rented SUV on a bleak, narrow dirt road in the middle of nowhere with no trace of life in sight, trying to find a small residential settlement where my relatives lived. Suddenly, I spotted violent red and white flashes reflecting in my rearview mirror. The security vehicles of the massive mining corporation that ruled the region were demanding that I pull over immediately for reasons unknown to me. Not wanting to cause any trouble in a country where I possessed absolutely no influence, I slammed on the brakes quickly and prepared myself to use my very rusty Russian, the bare basics of which I had picked up from my mother. But instead of the guards getting out of their vehicle and walking over slowly with dark shades on like highway cops do in Western movies, and security officer wearing a bulletproof vest took an aggressive, defensive stance behind his open car door. He began shouting at me through a heavy iron megaphone, commanding me to stick my arms entirely out of the car window and secure them flat on the roof. At that exact moment, a pure, unadulterated terror began to gnaw at my insides. In my civilian life, I had never even glinted a real weapon up close, let alone found the muzzle of an automatic rifle aimed straight at my chest. While I was screaming at the top of my lungs at this guard, assuring him that I was unarmed and just a terrified tourist, he treated me as if I were a hardened cartel boss. He barked at me to shut my mouth completely as he slowly advanced toward the window, his eyes blazing with fury. He pressed the barrel of his rifle right against my face while trying to roughly cuff my right hand with one hand, to the point that any accidental twitch or unintended slip of his trigger finger would have been enough to splatter my brains across the passenger seat. To top off all this panic, additional corporate armored vehicles began pouring into the area, completely cornering my path, before they violently dragged me out from behind the steering wheel and threw my body into the back of an armored transport bound for their mining maintenance detention facility. The hours I spent inside that freezing, subterranean stone cell represented, without a shadow of a doubt, the darkest and most hollow point of my entire life. The interrogators kept hurling terrifying accusations in my face, using words like traitor, industrial spy, and saboteur of critical infrastructure. One of the guards even recoiled a step when he first saw me, gasping aloud, "It's him in the flesh, the fox who leaked the blueprints." I began to suffer from waking nightmares while fully conscious. I envisioned myself buried alive in a black site prison on the edge of the Arctic for a crime I had absolutely nothing to do with. To make matters worse, the guards took turns coming over to the iron wall of the cell just to shout insults and death threats at me through the bars. I kept desperately trying to tell them that I was a Canadian citizen and that I was only here on a short holiday to visit my family. But their responses were limited to dry, mocking sarcasm, saying, "Do you think we are fools enough to buy these lies? Shut your mouth before we shut it for you our way." It was brutal threats like that, back to back. This living hell went on for several continuous hours, and I felt deep down that my life was completely over and that I would never see the light of day again. Then, out of the blue, there was a sharp jangle of keys, and the heavy cell door swung open. The chief interrogator stood there, coldly informing me that there had been a mix-up in identity and that I was free to leave immediately. Stepping out of that secret detention facility was a surreal experience that defied belief. My entire body was shaking like a wet bird, while the security personnel acted with a bizarre mixture of laughing off the blunder or offering dry, hollow apologies on a scale that didn't cover a fraction of the psychological and physical torment I had endured behind those bars. They treated the situation as if they had mistakenly slapped a parking ticket on the wrong car, rather than dragging me at gunpoint into a dark dungeon. But despite the fury boiling in my veins, I was just desperate to get out of there and save my skin. I was terrified, yet simultaneously consumed by a raging anger. But I didn't dare show a single spark of resentment out of fear that they would find another excuse to throw me back into the dark. But right before I took my final step outside the building, The investigator turned his computer screen toward me and showed me a photograph of the man they had confused me with. He was a dangerous, internationally wanted spy corporate saboteur, a truly high-risk individual, and when I stared at his picture, a shockwave froze my limbs. It was like looking directly into a polished mirror. The features were completely identical, in a way that was utterly terrifying and skin-crawling. When I finally reached my relative's house and asked them bitterly if I was legally or financially entitled to any form of compensation from the mining corporation, they erupted into cynical laughter before replying, "No chance of that happening here." Even though the rest of my trip was spectacular, and I cannot deny the breathtaking beauty of the wilderness there, I haven't entertained the thought of setting foot on those polar islands since that day. And next time I decide to travel, I am forcing my relatives to bring their own cars to pick me up right from the threshold of that bloody airport. The cruelest, most ominous day of my career was a freezing Tuesday night, specifically in a remote mountain town called Clearwater, nestled high in the Oregon Highlands. Back in that era, in the winter of 1985, Clearwater was a tiny town of fewer than 2,000 residents, just a forgotten rural enclave surrounded by dense pine forests. We only had a small supply store, a gas station, an old wooden lodge, and a large municipal lumberyard. Aside from a few scattered cabins on the edge of the mountain, that was pretty much the entire town. The place was quiet, and everyone knew one another. Words like execution or massacre were never spoken in our local vocabulary. We only ever heard of such atrocities on radio broadcasts from major cities. But all of that turned to ash on that dark night, when real evil stepped off the television screens to walk on its own 2 feet through the streets of our peaceful town. It was nearing 10 p.m. on November 5th, and I was stationed at the Federal Border Patrol headquarters about 2 miles south of town, where the temporary detention center is also located. I was sitting quietly behind my wooden desk, sorting through routine permit files handed to me by another officer, when the sudden crackle of the radio shattered the silence of the room with an urgent distress call from dispatch. Since it was the quietest day of the week, none of us expected anything more than a passing domestic dispute or a minor car slide due to the ice. So when the radio signals began broadcasting the encrypted codes for an armed group and multiple casualties, I froze in disbelief for a few seconds, completely convinced there had been a routing error or frequency interference. But the moment I saw my fellow officers frantically rushing out toward the front door and leaping into the 4x4 SUVs, I knew the nightmare was real and left no room for error. I followed them into the parking lot immediately, gunning my car right behind theirs to form a fast-moving military convoy, piercing through the thick fog toward the abandoned train station on the north side of town. Known locally as the Old Station, it served as the meeting point for miners and the final commuters before the winter rail lines closed down. Moving through the pitch black was eating away at my nerves, especially knowing that the people working the guard and maintenance shifts out there were mostly folks from my town, perhaps even close friends of mine. When we reached the perimeter of the station, the external iron gates were completely locked, and we had next to no idea what lay waiting for us behind them. The 911 distress call that had reached dispatch came from an on-site technician who was bleeding out from the attack. Due to the agonizing pain and sheer panic, he couldn't put together many details. All he could utter in broken words was that there were bodies, masked gunmen, and survivors fighting for their lives who needed us immediately. The station featured wide glass windows that stretched all the way along the main platform. As we approached with our flashlights raised, we caught sight of a wide, horrifying trail of dried blood winding from the outdoor waiting platform and vanishing into one of the old iron cargo boxcars parked in the back. After breaking through the gates and breaching the interior, we discovered that the bloody trail belonged to a station maintenance worker. Despite being shot twice, he had dragged his wounded body all the way from the back of the yard to the landline phone room at the front to call for backup before slipping into unconsciousness. The other officers and I spread out immediately, clearing the platforms and corridors aisle by aisle with our weapons drawn to ensure no ambush was waiting for us in the dark. It wasn't until we reached the abandoned boxcar number 9 at the end of the track that we uncovered the rest of the tragedy. There were 5 more people inside. 3 of them were completely devoid of life, and a 4th was groaning faintly, suffering from deep stab wounds to the chest and neck. For some bizarre reason that defied logic, the attacker had left the 5th person, a night custodian, completely unharmed without a single scratch. There was nothing we could do to save the 3 victims who had been torn apart by gunfire, so we focused all our medical efforts on keeping the 2 surviving, dying casualties stable. Fortunately, we managed to keep them alive until the medevac helicopters arrived. While the paramedics prepped the wounded to be airlifted to the regional hospital, we listened to the full, harrowing account of the disaster from the mouth of the surviving custodian, who walked away from the slaughter covered in his colleague's blood, but physically untouched. The narrative was far more grotesque and tragic than anything we could have imagined. Every Tuesday night, a specialized maintenance crew took over to clean the internal tracks, inspect the boxcar brakes, and prep them for the following week. After the last passenger train departed at exactly 8 p.m., the station master would lock the main doors behind him, and the workers would begin moving heavy equipment and firing up the power washers. During that time, the lone remaining ticket clerk spotted a stranger in a dark jacket stepping slowly out from between the gray shipping crates. She initially assumed it was a stranded commuter who hadn't noticed the station closing, and she walked over to inform him that operations had ended and he needed to leave. Instead of answering, he raised an automatic rifle directly into her face, striking her dead with silence. The maintenance crew was working on the opposite side of the platform at that exact microsecond. The gunman moved with such quiet, absolute confidence that they didn't even notice their colleague's disappearance or the danger bearing down on them. The gunman forced the clerk at gunpoint into the back administrative office while the workers remained completely oblivious to what was unfolding behind the walls. Once inside the office, he forced the station master to open the iron safe and hand over all the available cash and weekly ticket sales. His strike was perfectly timed, hitting right at the end of a heavy shipping season. He managed to seize a few $1,000s in cash, along with travelers' checks and money orders totaling $3,000. But instead of fleeing after getting his hands on the money, the gunman marched the station master and the clerk back out onto the cargo platform, rounding up the maintenance and cleaning crew under the weight of his weapon. I didn't personally see the restraints he used initially, but investigations later revealed he had grabbed heavy plastic zip ties stolen from the station's own shipping warehouse. He drove all 6 of them into the hollow belly of abandoned boxcar number 9 and ordered them at gunpoint to bind one another securely. He tied the last person up himself. Our survivor told us that once everyone was bound, they genuinely believed the ordeal was drawing to a close. The man had his money. He had everyone tied up to ensure they couldn't call the law right away, and he had absolutely no rational reason to do what he did next. Yet he went ahead and did it in cold blood. This is where the events took a deeply sadistic and subhuman turn. The gunman ordered the victims to lie down on the cold iron floor of the boxcar in pairs, forcing them to stack on top of one another like cords of firewood. Before anyone could decipher the horrific purpose behind this arrangement, he muttered in a low, audible tone, "May God forgive me for what I am about to do," and opened fire directly into the human stacks. He only managed to get a few shots off before his rifle suffered a mechanical jam or ran entirely out of ammunition. As he fled into the dark, the survivor believed for a second time that death had missed him and the nightmare was over. But seconds later, the butcher came running back, wielding a sharp hunting knife he had snatched from the maintenance tools. He stepped up to the survivor, asking in a dry, flat voice, "Are you going to tell the cops what I look like if you get out of here?" Naturally, the survivor cried out in terror, "No, I swear to you." The young man stacked on top of him, who he later learned was his own younger brother working on the same crew, did the same. But as the brothers desperately tried to convince him they wouldn't breathe a word to law enforcement, the killer snapped. He went into a frenzied, hysterical rage, stabbing the older brother on top with vicious, unchecked force. He dragged the blade across his throat from ear to ear, slicing his windpipe, and kept plunging the knife into his back until the metal blade snapped off inside the victim's body. The survivor claimed the killer, then turned to him a second time, asking with the exact same chilling calm if he would identify him to investigators given the chance. When the survivor repeated his denials and pleas, the gunman spun around with the bag of money and calmly walked out of the boxcar, leaving the last man alive in a pool of blood. Our survivor said he remained paralyzed in place out of pure dread, certain the maniac would return just as he did when he went to grab the knife. To make matters worse, his brother's lifeless body lay pinned on top of him with all its crushing weight and blood, making any attempt to move or wriggle free an impossible feat, even if he wanted to. After an agonizing stretch of silence, the other maintenance worker at the front of the boxcar, whom the killer assumed was dead from the initial gunfire, managed to painfully free his wrists from the plastic ties. He began a long, agonizing crawl toward the front platform, which was where we ultimately uncovered him, the landline receiver still clutched in his trembling hand. When the sweeping federal investigation took over in the following days, I don't remember ever being so emotionally invested or consumed by a case in my entire military career. One of the victims slaughtered in cold blood was a direct relative of the county's Border Patrol chief, turning the manhunt into a personal, vengeful mission to hunt the bastard down and bring him to justice. But right from a first step, the investigation began stumbling into flawed and complicated paths. First, it turned out that the train station's security camera and monitoring system was completely offline and out of service at the time of the attack. A repair technician had been scheduled to visit the station and fix the glitch the very next week. The timing of that malfunction haunted my thoughts and kept me awake for years because it stripped us of any footage or image of the suspect's face. Second, although all three survivors provided us with an identical and highly distinct description of the man, stating he had a crooked, deformed nose and strange hazel eyes, the composite sketches we circulated through newspapers and precincts yielded absolutely no sightings or leads. No solid ones, at any rate. All we got was a passing report of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding away from the edges of town via Mountain Highway 17. Even then, the timing didn't perfectly align with the moment of the massacre. By the time authorities tracked down and intercepted the vehicle later on, its owner was completely cleared of any involvement. He was just a traveler in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps the most frustrating and sickening part of the case was how the core federal team became utterly obsessed and fixated on a single, fleeting detail that I'm still not sure was even true. At one point while they were held inside the boxcar, one of the victims cried out through her tears, "Why are you doing this to us?" While she was referring to the degrading, barbaric way they were being stacked on top of one another like cattle, the psychopath apparently thought she was asking a deeper, existential question about his motives for the robbery. He replied with a cryptic phrase, claiming he was a former police officer who had been wrongfully terminated from the force. Even though early forensic checks proved there was zero match for his fingerprints in the national law enforcement databases, the lead investigators remained entirely convinced that the perpetrator's tactical execution pointed to a background in the military or law enforcement. This assumption completely contradicted what I and some of the local officers believed. We saw him as nothing more than a seasoned fugitive and international runner who slaughtered because he wanted no witnesses left behind to trace him. But by the time the federal team began treating our hypothesis seriously and shifted the direction of the manhunt, the killer could have easily slipped across international borders using the thousands of dollars and financial documents he plundered from the safe. That remains my best guess as to why he was never caught to this day. After the dust settled on the catastrophe, my colleagues in law enforcement spoke of what happened at the station as if it were a road tornado or a sudden act of God. They framed it as a random, tragic anomaly that no human could have predicted or prevented. But those words did nothing to wash away my absolute sense of helplessness and guilt. The most horrific crime in Clearwater's history since its founding 2 centuries ago had unfolded while I sat in total comfort behind my desk, filling out routine paperwork, while some sick bastard was stacking human beings and blowing their brains out 2 at a time at that very microsecond. But the greatest riddle that my mind still fails to untangle or comprehend to this day is, why did he deliberately let the last victim live? Our wounded survivor confirmed that the killer looked him dead in the eye and said textually, "I'm going to let you live to witness." That single phrase makes my fugitive theory about erasing witnesses look incredibly shaky and contradictory. Part of me tries to convince myself that he simply grew exhausted, his hands tiring of the slaughter, and he couldn't face the emotional or physical strain of plunging a blade into a second human being after believing he had already snuffed out 4 other lives inside. Yet, there's another part of me, a dark, quiet voice that whispers in the back of my mind, that believes the butcher intentionally left a lone survivor behind so he could tell the world exactly what happened in the dark. He wanted everyone to know what his hands had done and the terrifying precision of his execution, so he could later relish reading the gruesome details of his own craftsmanship in the pages of regional newspapers, sipping coffee somewhere out there in the world. I try to purge that final thought from my imagination whenever it creeps in, because when I dwell on it, the agonizing pain of failing to catch him and secure justice becomes an unbearable rot in my soul for the rest of my days. I spent the early years of my youth in the locked northern sector, a semi-abandoned industrial territory located in the furthest frozen expanses of the Federal Republic of Vanland. It was the year 2114, a time when this sector was ruled by the First Engineers, a radical, extremist faction that completely rejected the use of modern digital technology or wireless networks, relying entirely on ancient steam mechanics and heavy manual machinery. They referred to anyone belonging to the outer cities as an outsider, and that was my upbringing. We lived like alien outcasts on our own planet. But I knew no other life, so I was entirely content with my reality, until the dawn of November 2nd of that cursed year. Like most boys in that harsh society, I left basic education early to help my father in the family's massive steam turbine maintenance workshop. On that bitterly freezing morning, we were working together to dismantle a heavy iron engine, while my younger brother was over at the vocational training facility on the opposite side of the courtyard. Everything was proceeding according to our usual routine. Just another day amidst the deafening roar of machinery, when my father suddenly turned, looked toward the hazy horizon, and said in a suspicious tone, "Isn't that your little brother?" I raised my eyes and scanned through the thick fog, only to glimpse a tiny shadow running frantically between the railroad tracks toward our workshop. I knew instantly it was him. My father muttered in suppressed anger, "What the hell is he doing out of the training hall at this hour?" as the clock pointed to exactly 11 a.m. I followed my father as he bolted with wide strides toward the reception hall to find out what was happening. When we stepped inside, we found my brother drowned in tears, with my mother desperately trying to soothe his panic. My father initially assumed the boy had simply fled from his instructor to escape some punishment, so he was preparing to lecture him harshly. But when my brother finally managed to catch his breath and utter the words that had caused his flight, I felt as though the hands of the clock had frozen entirely, and the blood ran cold in my veins. He told us that a bizarre, deformed entity had breached the training hall, and that it carried a sharp hydraulic weapon. Yet, that wasn't even the most terrifying revelation, for as my father, trembling with rage, rushed toward his locker to pull out his heavy rifle, my brother added in a shaking voice that the creature was also hauling massive iron chains and jagged biological hooks. Panic consumed my father. He rushed like a madman out of the workshop toward the old training building, shouting back at me to stay exactly where I was and watch over my mother and brother. We were forced to wait for hours on end before my father returned, carrying the gruesome details of the tragedy that had unfolded inside. When he sat down with us, this is the full story of what he recounted. Around 10:30 that morning, shortly after the trainees had returned from their recess in the courtyard, a heavy iron cargo transport vehicle parked directly in front of the building's main entrance. A massive figure clad in a dark, leathery shroud stepped out, breached the interior, and coldly asked the female instructor if she had found a missing pressure valve in the outer corridor. A mechanical valve is an ordinary piece of iron hardware used to fasten and secure steam pipes, a common tool in the industrial sector, so practically everyone at the facility knew its shape and purpose. Since the instructor hadn't spotted anything of the sort that morning, she politely apologized for not being able to help, wishing him luck in finding his missing hardware. The individual's demeanor was profoundly unsettling. He refused to hold eye contact and merely muttered incoherent phrases before turning around to head back to his vehicle. But a single minute later, he barged back into the hall, this time wielding a pneumatic, bolt-throwing weapon, shouting at everyone to submit to his commands or have their bodies ripped apart. Assuming it was a straightforward raid for fuel reserves or spare parts, the instructor ordered the trainees to remain calm and comply with his demands. But instead of plundering the workshop, safe, and fleeing, the man ordered all the boys present, including my brother, to help him unload items from his transport and carry them inside the classroom. They hauled in a collection of sharp tools, a portable flamethrower, and a high-voltage electrical stunner, alongside massive stacks of thick timber, wiring, chains, and what we later learned were heavy iron eye hooks used for suspending flesh. This entity wanted to force the children to witness the biological ritual he intended to inflict upon them. However, while the intruder was occupied supervising the unloading from his truck, the instructor seized a moment of distraction, bolted for the exit, and successfully reached the outer gate guardian to blast a critical distress signal to the federal security forces. Realizing the instructor had slipped through his fingers, the captor ordered one of the boys to go out and drag her back, then immediately set about barricading the building's doors using the timber and heavy nails the boys had brought inside. Once he finished sealing off the exits, he allowed 3 individuals to leave, including a pregnant maintenance worker, along with all the male trainees in the hall. Immediately after, he forced all the remaining girls and female apprentices to line up in a straight row facing the solid metal wall, as if preparing to execute them all by himself. The first federal security vehicles arrived at the perimeter just minutes after the automated distress signal was flagged. Using his external loudspeaker, the commanding officer pleaded with the armed entity to drop his weapons and allow the trainees to exit safely. At the exact same time, the intruder patched a call through to the operations command room, explicitly threatening the dispatcher that if any force advanced a single inch toward the barricade, he would execute the hostages instantly. He was barking these ultimatums right in front of the terrified girls, ensuring they knew exactly what was about to happen. Hysterical, they began weeping and begging him not to hurt them. 2 of the girls even pleaded to be shot first, likely hoping that sacrificing themselves might buy the other children time or spare their lives. But the man ordered them to be quiet and kept negotiating with the forces outside. My father said that by 11 a.m., a massive crowd of miners and engineers had gathered tightly around the security cordons, with emergency medical transports lining up to evacuate the wounded. Then suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted from within. My father described the sound that rose from the surrounding crowd as something no human ear should ever hear, a collective, agonizing wail of mourning. For every echoing blast meant the extinguishing of an innocent young life and the shattering of families whose hearts would never fully heal. As the shots continued to pop off, the security forces rushed the barricaded doors to breach the building and halt the slaughter. But the intruder anticipated their breach and began firing heavy iron bolts at the officers from high upper window. The forces returned heavy fire, taking care to target only the specific window from which they were being pinned down. Suddenly, the gunfire from inside ceased. The officers assumed he had either been hit or was reloading his weapon. But when they finally shattered the reinforced door and stormed the main hall, they found him lying dead on the floor from a single, self-inflicted projectile wound to his own head. It was later revealed that just seconds before opening fire, he had tried to call his residential unit to say goodbye to his partner. It seemed she hadn't answered, but he left a recorded voicemail message. When she arrived home later, the first thing that caught her eye was a set of handwritten journals on the table detailing the bloody layout he planned to execute that day. She had called emergency services immediately in a desperate bid to stop him, but her warning came entirely too late. Her partner was already minutes away from murdering innocent children. The wounded girls were rushed to the military hospital under heavy escort. Of the 10 children struck that morning, only 4 survived. A few were pronounced dead at the scene, and I learned that one little girl passed away right in the arms of a federal officer as he desperately tried to comfort her and wipe the blood from her face. The victims were all between the tender ages of 6 and 13. For some incomprehensible reason, in the middle of the massacre, the intruder decided to stop using his pneumatic bolt thrower and switch to using the portable flamethrower to incinerate the rest, even though he still possessed ample ammunition for his first weapon. Many forensic investigators believe he switched weapons deliberately to inflict maximum disfigurement and create severe biological devastation, making the scene even more grotesque than it already was. No one could comprehend the motive behind such behavior. Death is absolute, but deliberately making the scene as mutilated and horrific as possible seemed like a brand of pure evil that defies human understanding. But after the investigation laid bare his identity, and more importantly, his underlying motive, the sick puzzle began to fit together. Discovering the identity of the perpetrator sent a violent shockwave through the entire locked northern sector, because almost everyone knew the man. His name was Marcus Vane, and he lived in the lower residential complex. He worked as the driver for the fluid and fuel transport rigs that visited local workshops and farms on a rigid schedule, sometimes multiple times a week. He actually knew the families of some of the children he slaughtered, and he had a partner and 2 kids of his own at the time of his attack. The investigators interviewed his coworkers, who stated that despite his long history of psychological and behavioral disorders, he seemed bizarrely cheerful and elevated in the days leading up to the massacre. This sudden euphoria was undoubtedly born from his decision to execute the harvest and construct the biological incubator, which had granted him a twisted sense of absolute power and control. The security agencies also believed he drew inspiration from a similar hostage crisis that had hit the vital Colorado sector during that very same week. Of course, there was no way to get definitive answers from him since he was dead, but he laid out the precise drives that pushed him to commit this atrocity in the journals and the voicemail recording he left behind. It turned out that Marcus suffered from severe genetic mutations and biological hallucinations that drove him to harm children. Records showed he had abused 2 of his female relatives when he was just 12 years old, and he confessed to his partner that he was experiencing vivid waking fantasies of doing it again. This explained the specialized synthetic gels and biofluids recovered by forensic units at the scene, meant to build a grotesque biological hatchery. Marcus also claimed in his journals that the death of his daughter 10 years prior during childbirth was the catalyst for his destructive desires. He wrote that he was filled with venomous hatred toward himself and the Creator due to her loss. Although his 2 female relatives completely denied the historical abuse allegations, investigators concluded that their denial was simply driven by a desire to maintain privacy and escape social stigma. The community ultimately concluded that Marcus was nothing short of a psychotic monster, as he never physically touched the girls inside the hall, choosing instead to execute them in cold blood before taking the coward's way out. Throughout the week that followed the tragedy, federal bulldozers completely demolished the old training facility, leveling it to the ground so it could no longer stand as a physical monument to that horror. While the stoic grace of the first engineers community filled me with a sense of pride in many ways, it simultaneously marked the beginning of my realization that I did not belong among them, and that I could not stay. For instance, one of the very first things the elders of the faction did was approach Marcus's father, who was entirely shattered and devastated by what his son's hands had wrought. They told him face to face that they forgave his son for his actions. In fact, a massive crowd of locals even attended Marcus's burial as a profound show of solidarity for his broken family. Initially, I thought this stance was noble. It certainly wasn't the parents' fault that their son had mutated into a sick monster. But the specific detail that my mind flatly refused to accept, and which filled my soul with revulsion, was their choice to extend that total absolution and forgiveness to the butcher himself. These engineers were conditioned never to harbor grudges or malice under any circumstances, but I simply could not find it in the depths of my being to forgive a parasite who brought biological containment fluids into a hall full of innocent young girls just to liquidate them and snuff out their lives. There was a pervasive cultural philosophy promoting the idea that the capacity to forgive makes you a spiritually superior, elevated human being. When it came to the concept of prevention and securing the outpost against future horrors, their common refrain was simply, "The matter rests in the hands of the Creator now. The Almighty alone is responsible for shielding us." I distinctly remember another worker telling me he felt relieved that Marcus Vane had taken his own life, because it meant he stood before divine judgment at the exact microsecond we were laying those poor girls to rest, and that if he repented a fraction before death, his sins would be washed away. The more I dwelled on this philosophy, the greater my sense of isolation grew, and I realized with absolute certainty that I possessed no home within this radical ideological framework. Now, nearly 10 full years have passed since I packed my belongings and left the locked northern sector behind me, never once looking back. Thank you, my friends, for listening and following along. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can be alerted to all future novels and stories